Hey, what's going on? Welcome to AngularAir. I'm your host, Justin Schwarzenberger, and on today's episode, we are going to be talking scalable Angular architectures. Should be pretty cool as usual. So let's get into it. First, we'll say hi to our panelists, and then we'll meet our guests. Joining us today, we have Alyssa Nichol. Alyssa, how's it going?
Hey, everyone. Glad to be here.
Awesome. We have Mike Brocky with us. Mike, what's going on?
Not too much. Happy to be here.
Cool. And Bonnie Brennan. Bonnie, how's it going?
It's going great. I feel like this is going to be a super fun episode already. I can just feel it.
It is. It is. Don't we have a term for it?
Awesome sauce.
Yeah. Awesome
That's what
sauce.
I was thinking as soon as I found out who our guest was today. I was very excited.
Speaking of our guest, Juan Herrera. Juan, how's it going?
Hey everyone, I'm super excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. We're super excited to have you. Juan, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself for those that don't know who you are?
Sure. So my name is Juan Herrera. I am from Colombia and I live in Medellin. I'm a Google developer expert in Angular, and I'm also the head of front-end development of a company called UXI Global. It's more like I'm an American company. I work for American clients, but I'm based here in Medellin. And I think that'll be it.
I remember the first time I met you, I think we were at ngConf and we were talking about ng community meetup, and you were like thinking about maybe starting a meetup, and you had this like wild like neon hair, and now you're basically like a rock star in Medellin.
Thanks to you. I mean,
Thanks to you, I know how to say Medellin.
Well, you did it pretty well. Yeah, the truth is that, like, I don't know, about 2 years ago, I met Bonnie at ngConf, and she convinced me of running a community in Medellin, which is called Angular Medellin. And today it is a very big thing in Colombia. Actually, we made a conference, the first conference of Angular in the whole Latin America after we ran the community. And well, it was super exciting. It's called NG Colombia. We're going to have another edition this year. I might be able to show you some pictures later. But yes, thanks to Bonnie. Bonnie was the catalyzer of all these things.
Actually, that would be you. You were the catalyzer, and I'm amazed at what you've done and how much you've grown your meetup, and I'm honored to be your friend. I'm so excited.
Thank you. It's a community efforts, right? Yeah.
Always, for sure. For sure. All right. Scalable Angular architectures. That's the topic for today?
That's correct. Yes. Okay, so
I'm going to need you to break that down. That's like up here. I need it down here so that I can get a better feel of what we're diving into.
Sure thing. So it's very simple, actually. One of the things that I've noticed ever since I started like building Angular applications for enterprise, for companies, I've noticed that there are certain patterns, certain methodologies or techniques you can use to make sure your code base is maintainable and it's scalable in time. That includes, for example, folder structure, code patterns, way to create your classes, your functions, the different strategies you can use when naming variables or naming your own files, that kind of things. It's what we're going to talk about today. So if Justin, I guess I'm ready. If you want to share my screen, I can just start.
All right. Yeah, we're set.
All right. So let's start over here. So this is Scalable Angular Architectures. So
actually, we can't see it though.
You cannot see it?
You, which is always fine, but we don't see your screen right now.
Oh, really? Interesting. So you're sure not seeing my brow? Oh, okay, let me try that.
No, just
Okay.
faces. Oh, there it goes.
There you go.
Aha, we got it.
Perfect. So as part of my introduction, I should mention that I also created something called Angular Now, which is like a bookmark that you can use to run a Angular project hosted on GitHub on Stacklix. It's pretty much doing anything in particular, anything special. It's just doing a URL redirect. But it turns out that when I publish this thing, it had a lot of traffic on Twitter. People were really interested in it. And the curious thing about it is that it was just one line of code. So yeah, this is the ironic parts of life. But yeah, I wanted to share this with you in case you ever find it or you want to use it.
But you have to get a lot of bonus points for that font. That Angular now, that's pretty slick.
Thank you. Yeah, I stole it from someone else actually, but yeah, thank you. Anyway, so yeah, let's jump.
Yeah, really quick on that. So that if I have a repo that I want to launch on Stack Blitz, I use that for that case. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So you just put your bookmark on the browser, and once you have a repository with an Angular project in it, you can just click the bookmark. It's called a bookmarklet, and it will automatically run the repository on Stackblitz. Is that simple? It's actually Stackblitz is the one doing all the work here, but I just came out with the idea of doing it easier for everyone. And
why does your browser look different? What is this browser?
Because this is Chrome.
Okay. It looks so different than my Chrome, and I like it. Anyways, continue.
Sure. Anyway, so let's just get right into the content. So first of all, I want to give you all a warning, and it's that some of the things I might mention here might not apply to you. And sometimes when it comes to standards, it might be your team, the one that makes the final call. So what I'm going to give you today is a set of practices I recommend, but they are not necessarily mandatory. You can use your own set of standards if you want to. And let's start with the very base, and that is the problem, right? Like, what's the problem we're looking at right now? And I believe the problem is the complexity of applications. When you have an application, an Angular application with just one component and one module, everything is a breeze. It's easy. It will scale no matter what. But when you have a lot of features, a lot of architectural drivers, quality attributes, functional and non-functional requirements, it becomes more complex. So in order to tackle this down, I'm going to give you some of the practices, tips, methodologies I use to fix this. But I'm going to do it in a particular format. I'm going to use the interview format. The interview is pretty much me asking Justin, Mike, Bonnie, and Ali, Elisa, all the questions I'm going to make today, like if it were a technical interview, and I expect you to answer, so that it is more fun. And by the way,
before you can continue here, I want to preface to the audience, anybody who's watching, we have not been prepped for this at all.
No, we have not.
And what have you. So this is all off the cuff, and sure, let it rip.
We're really nervous now. We didn't know we were going to have a quiz.
I think that anything that Mike says in this podcast should be taken as pure truth. So, we can let him take point on most things.
And we will be watching the chat for help from the audience. So if you're
throwing
really hard questions, you guys have to help us out.
Oh, I love that idea.
Yeah. I'd like to use the lifeline, please.
You'll be fine. No worries. One of the things I always consider when making an interview is this mantra. It's like trying to, or making sure the candidate feel comfortable at all times. I tend to interview a lot of people here in UXC, and my primary goal is to help them relax, try to teach them something new. Well, when I'm asking them something and they don't know the answer, I often give them the answer and say like, okay, this is what you should consider next time. And maybe you should study these things because it will make you a better fit for next time. That kind of thing. This is what I'm looking forward to. So no worries, you'll be all fine.
I don't know, because I don't think any of the four of us feel comfortable right now.
All right, Mike, let's start with you. Mike, how do I define a scalable architecture? If I were the interviewer and you were a candidate, how would you answer this question?
I would first clarify and ask if you were talking about scalable horizontally or vertically, or what type of scaling are you talking about? Is it scaling to be able to support multiple team members, or is it scaling to support multiple aspects of the application, or what type of scaling are you looking for?
Mike, let me tell you something. You answered correctly. The answer is it depends. Very well. Yeah,
I'm done for the day.
We're so proud of you, Mike.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the right answer. And it's the best answer you can give in any interview question you have with me. It's like if I ask a very broad question, like the best answer is to say like, okay, what use case are you referring to? What particular scenario do you want to look at? And some of the scenarios we might be able to take a look at today are these ones. Folder structure, modularization, code pattern, state management, and of course, vertical and horizontal scaling. So that was a great answer. And I think we're ready for the very second question, which is, let's say we want to make a folder structure scalable. How do we keep my folder structure scalable? Let's go with Justin. Justin, what do you say?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is having things grouped together that are similar. So that folder structure, the things that I've run into before in the past, I think, in terms of the need to restructure your folder structure throughout the life cycle of the process of the project, as well as adding things to it. So keeping similar things close together, I think, is advantageous for the ability to do that. So that'd be my answer.
I think that's the right answer as well. Very well, Justin. That's correct. I believe what you're just saying is that sometimes it is better to keep artifacts grouped in a folder where you can see all the functionality related together, which is because it makes more sense, even cognitively, like being able to open a folder and see every single artifact, be it a service, a class, a pipe, that is related, and then understand how all those components relate to each other. I think that's a great answer. If I were to give you the next step to look at, maybe I would answer in an interview question with a popular pattern. One of those is called lift. Lift is pretty much a pattern. I guess it was John Papa or someone related that came up with this some time ago. And it's a pattern you can use to keep your folder structure scalable. And of course, in there, you're going to see this recommendation you did. So you probably heard of lift before, but let's take a look at every single letter, like lift, L, locate. So locate is pretty simple. Locate is how quickly can you locate files in a project. So pretty much related to what you just said. Like, how about if I show you this structure over here? And I tell you, Justin, like, okay, it turns out that there is a bug in our footer. In which folder would you search the bug? Well,
is the bug visual or is it like functional? Like
that's a great question, right? Of course. Like, okay, what's the bug related to? Is it visually? Is it related to services? Is it related to logic or anything? Well, that's the kind of question you will be asking if you were assigned a bug. Now, is the structure, it would be much easier to know where to search for the bug, because then you will automatically know the bug is like 90% of the times included in this folder, where you have all the artifacts related to the footer, be it a component, a service, a pipe, or whatever. Then if you had this, well, this works pretty well when you have a small code base, like when things are simple, etc. But when things are scaling up, sometimes having a domain-driven, or whatever you want to call it, structure is much easier to identify where bugs or new features need to be implemented. So that's number one, that's locate. Then we have identify. Which is how quickly can you identify a file's purpose. So let's take a look at this other example. Here, for example, we have a header, which is a folder that contains the header directive, the model, the pipe, the service. So one of the things that once you look at this structure, you automatically can tell what every file's purpose is. You know that this one is probably for transforming something in the view, this one is probably to fetch some information in the header, and so on and so forth. This is a pretty Angular structure that you will see very common in any Angular code base, and it helps you identify what every file is for. So this is something I recommend you to keep doing.
So quick question on this part. Would this be the smallest that you suggest breaking down components? Or would you ever be like, hey, the header has, I don't know, like these nav items, and we're going to break those down into their own folders as well? Or is there a point where it gets too crazy?
Lovely. I love that question. That's actually the next item, but you're right. That the answer to that question is that depends. But let's take a look at the second part, and the third part of lift, which is the flat. How flat is your folder tree? And here's where subset or smaller components come into play. Let's take a look at this structure. Well, you've probably seen this before, right? It's like super complex to look on folders, etc., etc. When you have a header and you have a list and you have an item and a title and a description, and you make a component out of each one of those, your folder structure is going to end up looking like this, which again is not very easy to read or probably easy to maintain. So you got to be very careful on how many nested levels does your folder have. So that's one thing to consider. Try not to make it very long, but don't oversimplify it either. That's pretty much. And that's the answer to your question, Elisa.
I love it. I love it.
Can I add one thing in here?
Sure.
So one of the things that this kind of comes out of play from is like the experience of going down this route, right? So for people that are coming into this that may be thinking, okay, how do I architect my application? But I've never really gone that deep into getting something that crazy. These are the things that you're kind of illustrating, especially like what we see on the screen right here, something that we can get into fairly quickly if we go down the route of a certain pattern. And then by that point, we're like, man, we get our file structure, we're all built out. It becomes a headache or a challenge to re-architect that. So as a beginner, we're looking to say, what keys can we get to kind of get ahead of the game so that our structure is ready to go and grows with us, so that we don't have to be making these wholesale changes later. And who can tell us about that that's run into that scenario? So I just want to kind of clarify that for our audience and stuff like that, and this is a great example of what you're showing here. Like, you can really get into the situation quick, and then you're like, man, nested folders. Okay, so these are the things to think about ahead of time.
Lovely. Yeah, totally agree with you, Justin. I mean, I wish I had like all these tips and practices and patterns way before in time, because that way I would have built like better architectures. But yes, this is pretty much for people that are starting to build their architectures and they want to know how things will look in time. Well, this will give you an insight. And it's worth clarifying that this is not necessarily bad. Of course it's not. It's just, it has an overhead to it. And you have to be conscious of it. You have to be aware that you will need to do some refactorings at some point if you don't handle this correctly. So just to bear in mind. So I think we're good. I don't know. This is, oh, I include this in here. Yes, it's because I saw some similar thing here. You can see this is structure. This is like a triangle here. I see this triangle also in the callback hell, typical code base. It's pretty similar. Actually, this is also called the Pyramid of Doom, which is actually real. I took a picture of them. It's here. Ha ha ha. No, I'm just kidding.
I knew we were going to have fun today.
Anyway, let's go for the last part of lift, which is, no, I think we're already finished with lift. This is an additional tip I would like to share with you. It's also included in the Angular style guide, and it's keeping 7 files per folder. According to a friend of mine, the human eye can only see 7 files at the same time and kind of relate them together. Know how they connect to each other in one look. But if you have more than 7 files in a folder, you will need an additional effort kind of to understand how all those things relate together.
Wow.
So
I love this so much. I love specifics like this. It always gives like a specific guideline, and then there's a reason behind it. So I love that one.
Totally. Thank you. Yes, I think it's important. As long as we keep things easier for us as developers and maintainable for the product, I think, yes, we should follow these guidelines. So yeah, this is my final advice. And finally, try dry, which is the last part of lift, which is probably something you heard before. You hear it with Sander in the last AngularAir, I believe. Don't repeat yourself, right? The more you repeat yourself, the more bugs you probably need to fix, the more places you need to implement the same logic, and so on and so forth. And try not to do that. And one strategy I'll suggest is using the smart DOM pattern, which is very common in component-oriented architectures, whether it's React, Vue, or Angular. You can use this structure. I'm not going to dive too deep into this. If you have this, keep using it. If you haven't, take a look at the smart DOM, or also known as stateful and stateless component, which will allow you to save a lot of code and don't repeat yourself. So I guess this is pretty much it to the folder structure. Scalability. And do you have any
on the dry?
Sure. Yep.
Really quick. One of the things that I think people run into, I know I've ran into this, is as soon as you start kind of grouping these things together, and then you find common code that you want to share across them, right? I kind of run into this decision: do I extract that and put it somewhere else and share it between the two? Or would I go to the step of maybe repeating that code, if it's simple code, in their own separate domains per se? So like if I had two folders, a footer and a header, and probably this wouldn't be a good example. It'd have to be something more detailed, but let's say it's that case and I had some shared code between the two. I could elevate that shared code to like a common directory, but then I've got it in a separate place from the header and a separate place from the footer, and I've got to go search for it to share it, right? At what point is there any point that which you might consider duplicating that in the header and the footer, because then it stays grouped together with it?
Justin, go ahead, Mike.
I was just saying that looks exactly like the question that Constantine was asking in the chat earlier about how to organize Angular libs under the same repo, which are depending on each other. This is a thing we run into kind of a lot.
Yeah, I totally agree. And Justin, I think you raised a very elegant point, because at sometimes I always keep hearing you should not repeat your code at all. Like there's no reason to repeat your code, but I believe there are certain times where it might make sense to repeat the code under particular circumstances. And to answer your question, I have something called the Abstraction Analogy. But that's something we're going to look at in the presentation a little bit ahead in a few slides. So just keep your question there. I'll answer that in a second.
Yeah, way to jump ahead, man.
No, that was a great question. Okay, so let's jump into the next question, and that's going to be for Bunny. Bunny, how do you modularize your code? How do you keep it in separate modules? What strategy would you use to achieve this?
Well, it depends.
Oh my gosh.
No, the question is how do you, not when do you.
Well, no, he said that was the best answer for any question. He did say that, so I had that answer ready. No matter what the question was, it depends.
It depends on what, Bunny?
So, I mean, for me, because I love bad analogies. And so for modularizing code, I like to use the analogy of spaghetti versus Legos, right? I think the most important thing when you're trying to be modular is to break it down into small pieces that are self-sufficient. So if I have one component that depends on every other component that depends on every other component that depends on every other component, it gets really hard to take one piece out and use it separately. So for me, the most important thing is to make sure that each piece can stand on its own, or at least as much as within that. Yeah, and then there's the whole thing about sibling inheritance, which basically the very short version is you can take from your parents, because your parents are very generous, but your siblings are not. And if you have siblings, you know what I'm talking about. So you could you can inherit from files above you, but not folders next to you. Yeah?
I love it. I love it, Bonnie. I think that's a great answer. I mean, if this were a real interview, you would have gotten very far.
I got the job, you guys.
Not just yet, but let me give you a so to do a quick recap. I guess what you mentioned with the Lego analogy, which I love, is that somehow these Lego parts are easy to exchange, move around. They're not tightly coupled. So it's easier to maintain your code, to extend it, to add new functionality, so on and so forth. So that's the kind of a structure we should be aiming at, not keeping everything so together like a monolith, like a complex monolith, where you can just, like a Jenga tower. It's like the Jenga tower versus the Lego tower. Like the Jenga tower, you move something around and it might fall anytime. But with a Lego tower, you're like more confident because you can separate things and it's not gonna fall apart. And so that's what we're looking at it right now. One of the things I would suggest if I were interviewing a candidate is that this person mentioned the modules in Angular, right? Modules are a very important part of Angular. To me, those are probably the most important part of Angular. Every time I'm interviewing someone, modules is the kind of topic I want to chat a lot. Like let's discuss it. What do you think modules are for? How would you use them? What do you think modules allow you to do in your code? That kind of thing, I think is super key. So when you have an application like this one, you will see that these different folders are modules. And modules, as I understand it, are simply folders, as Justin mentioned it in the beginning, that group related artifacts together. Just like Dominion, they have a similar domain, so they're like in the same domain group together. So everything related to contact is inside the contact folder, which is a module itself. So that's the way I see it, and I deeply suggest using modules in your course. If you were talking about a very small application, modules might not make much sense. But if you're talking about a big application, you certainly need to take a look at this. Now, the interesting part about modules is that there are some special modules in Angular. If you're again someone that is probably about to design an architecture for your new project, well, consider having a core and a shared module. And let me explain the difference between these two. It's pretty simple. Share module, it's a module where you put artifacts that are shared for every other module out there. Say, for example, you have a button that it's like a super typical button you're using very much, then you put it here, and then you can use it inside the sign up, the header, the footer. That's a very typical use case. Now, on the other hand, core is more aimed at singletons. If you're not familiar with singletons, don't despair. It's a pretty simple concept. It's about making the instance of a service available for the whole application just once, instead of creating new instances every time. You can take a look at singleton in Google if you want to know more, but pretty much it will allow you to have services that are only whose instance is shared across the whole project. If we were to take a look at what an artifact inside those modules might look like, then we might take a look at this slide. Here, for example, in the share module, we have the user. Oh, I made a mistake here. Anyway, in the core module, I have an authentication service. This authentication service is needed to be a singleton because I want to make sure that every single component or module in my application uses the same instance. If that's not the case, every time someone creates a new instance of the authentication service, they're gonna lose all the information of the user, the email, the key, the token, whatever. So you need to make sure that remains as a singleton. Where when it comes to shared services or components, well, in this case, it's not as critical because, for example, if you're using the user service, you can create a new instance because this service is kind of a service that is not holding information most of the time, or sometimes it's like just being used to fetch information or put or post information. But authentication on the other side, it is needed to be a singleton. So take a close look at core and share next time you're defining your modules in your application. Any questions so far?
Not really a question, more of a comment about the idea of how we have different types of modules. If you look at the modules that you have listed in the different folders, taking aside the quote-unquote special ones of core and shared, you have two different types. You have a type that's basically a feature for a user that they would navigate to, like a separation of different logic. And then you also have like the idea of different things that would be used across different modules. Like the header and footer would be used on a contact page as well as on a sign-up page. But you have two different types of modules there.
Yeah, totally agree. And for the record, the modules themselves are not actually different. They are just regular modules. It's just that they are instanced differently. Core, for example, it's only instanced once in the add module. You put it in the imports array just once, and that's how you make a given module core. The name doesn't have anything to do with how it works. It's just a convention. And same for share. Share, on the other hand, is just imported in every module that needs to be used. So that's pretty much the difference. But though at the very end, those are just regular modules. Maybe there's a third module that it's worth mentioning here, and it's the material module. This is a module I recommend to people who is using material design. It's pretty much creating a module that will import and re-export every material module you're using. So you're using the button, the navbar, the spinner, or whatever thing you're using across your application constantly. Then instead of importing it in every module every time, you just import this kind of gateway that it's in charge of, gathering all the modules you use very often, and then just putting it together available for either the whole application or for given modules in particular.
And that would be like a specific, basically a more specific version of a shared module then, correct? You're basically using it to consolidate multiple modules together.
Exactly. Totally. It's an interesting pattern to take a look at.
And so the shared, putting the material modules in a separate, so basically it's the same, it behaves the same as if you had put them in the shared, but we put them separately just because if you end up using material, there could be a lot of them, and this just keeps it separate to keep all your files cleaner so that everything in shared is what you wrote. Is that right?
Yes, and it makes it easy for you to import material modules next time. Because say, for example, in the header, you're using 3 modules of material. If you are, and you're not using this approach, then you need to go to the header module and import the 3 of them, or maybe the 10 of them. But if instead you're using the material module and you are importing and re-exporting them, then the next time you need them, you just import material into the header, and that's it. So it keeps your code more tight, more clean.
It also helps you avoid circular dependencies. If you have components in the shared module that are using the shared module, that's no bueno. But but you can use the material module without having any issues with dependencies.
Exactly. Very well.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because I think a lot of us, when we think about using modules in ng module, we're thinking, okay, we're going to add components or services or something to it, right? But in this scenario, it's just simply using it to group things together and re-export and use that. So it's another way to use ng modules that maybe we're normally not thinking about, right? But it's an advantage that we can take advantage
of. Totally. Now, interestingly enough, I have another tip I want to share with you when it comes to writing, also files or important. When you have a lot of modules, let's put it this way: when you have a lot of modules, sometimes it becomes a little hard to import, share components into another module, because what you will end up having is something like this. It's like you need to go back to the root and try to find a component and import it, or the module, or whatever. This is a very typical thing I see in code bases when they have several modules, or when they have a very nested approach to folders. So this is something that whenever you see it, well, you should know that you can avoid this by simply using a feature of TypeScript called path mapping. Path mapping, it's just about going to the TS file, tsconfig file, and then adding the paths here. You're kind of telling them, like, anytime someone needs the core module, just use add core. So the next time, it will look like this, which is much more easier to read and less bug prone, because you will be able to find the file easier, etc., etc. And refactorings will be much easier. So it makes it much more easy to read.
I love this feature so much, and I love all your GIFs. But I had a problem because I use this particular feature in pretty much every project that I work on. If it's not already there, I implement it like my first day. That's the first thing I do, because of all the dot, dot, dash. Like you can't go back once you've done it. But I actually have a question for Justin, because I'm working on a project now that has NX, and I can't do that. Did you know?
NX supports that. NX, yeah, that was one of the core things with NX, is the ability to be able to do this.
I can't figure.
Yeah.
Then maybe I should just keep trying then.
I can help you out with that.
I love you, Justin. You're great. Okay, and then also there was a question in the chat from Bjorn. Do you happen to know what happens with the tree shaking of the modules when you use material modules like this? And actually, Brian Love and I had a whole conversation about this just last week, about whether or not it would automatically tree shake and how that works and how it's bundled. So do you know about that off the top of your head, Juan? We did some researching, Brian Love and I, and he actually did a really cool demo on this. But if you're familiar with this, I'll let you answer, because you're the star today.
No, if you did a demo of like trying to find the solution to that question, then I'll rather have your answer. My guess is that it might be tree shakeable at the end. I mean, as long as let's use a particular example. I believe that if you're importing this material module only in the header, but the header is not being imported anywhere else, then technically it will be tree shaked, and none of these two modules will end up in the production build. But I'll leave it up to you.
The answer that Brian came up with in the demo that he put together after our discussion, because we weren't like we were kind of like thinking it would handle things different ways, but I was actually pretty surprised. What happened was, if you have something that's pulled into your project in a separate module like this, it would be loaded in your common JS, which is actually like loaded after your main. So it did load. We found that in places we were kind of actually surprised about a little bit of the behavior, but it was really cool. Maybe we can have him on for an episode another time and dive deeper into that. But basically, it was loading everything, and it was actually working really well. But it was deferring loading the stuff that's lazy loaded. So if you're using a separate module and in a feature branch that's lazy loaded, anything that's used in more than one place would show up in common JS, according to VLove.
Okay, great point. Thank you. All right, I guess we finally reached the place where Justin wanted to be at, and it's answering this question. This is something called the abstraction analogy, and this is like a simple approach I use to when I need to understand where to put a given artifact. Like, where do I put this? It's like, where does this belong to? Or should I duplicate the code? So for someone that often struggles with this, like people out there keep asking me questions like, oh, where do I put this service? Or where should this module be located at? And that's a very typical question. That's completely fine. So this is an analogy I tend to use very often, and I'm going to explain it right now. By the way, this is one of my favorite movies. If any of you recognize it, I love you. It's called Fantastic Mr. Fox. You should.
Oh, we didn't get to answer. I was about
to.
I know.
Anyway, so an artifact belongs to the same folder level where it is required. So let's take a look at this. If a variable is only used within the scope of a function, then it belongs to the function because no one else needs it. So it's pretty simple. It's like, oh, that makes sense, of course. But then if a variable is used by several functions in a class, then it belongs to the class because several functions need access to that given variable. So it's like that's the pattern. But let's keep going up. If the variable is used by several components, then it belongs to a service where each one of these components can access it. Otherwise, if it's just inside a component, it might be harder to access. And then if the service is used by several modules, then it belongs to a share module. And this is where the share module connects, right? Like if we have a service or a component that is used by several modules, then we put it on a share module. But then let's go a little bit up. What if the service is used by several applications? Then we can put the whole module or application in its own repository. And then it can be used by several applications. A typical use case of this is like, for example, when you're creating an application that has a mobile and a web platform. So you might want to reuse some of the services you created. So you can put that in a repository that it's consumed by the mobile application, be Ionic or native script, and the web application that can be anything else. So this is like the analogy. An artifact belongs to the same folder level where it is required. Was that clear? That make sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
But just like any rule, there can be exceptions to the rule.
Totally.
That if something that you're abstracting may make sense within that locality, but it may not make sense to extract it beyond there and potentially replicate that logic in multiple places.
Totally. Yeah, Mike, I completely agree with you. No, this is not definitely another rule, and it's definitely not mandatory. This should just give you an idea. If you're, for example, an amateur in Angular and you don't know where to put things, this should give you an insight of where you can put it. But of course, there are exceptions where it might make more sense, just as Justin mentioned in the beginning, that you do replicate some code because, given the circumstances, that will scale better or so. So yes, good point.
Is this the same as the sibling kind of thing, where you can get it, you can share with the folder that you're in, but you should not be sharing with the folders next to you?
I'm not sure I know about that approach, but it seems like it's similar. I don't know.
Like as soon as you want to try to take something, if you want to import something from a sibling folder, that whatever you're trying to import should probably be pulled out into the parent.
Okay, yes, that's kind of the thing. Yeah, pretty much the same concept.
Yeah, it's just a different way. That's the way I explain it, is because siblings don't like to share.
No, I love it. I actually never heard of that, how to call it, family issue in coding before, but yes, totally. It's pretty much the same thing summarized. Okay, well, let's go to the next question so we can just kind of wrap this up. This is very interesting, and this is aimed at ELISA. ELISA, what standard should I follow for naming?
I don't know if you're gonna like my answer, but I think the standard you follow is less important as the consistency that you use. So whatever it is your team decides on, stick with it, because otherwise it's just a nightmare. That's my answer.
ELISA, that was a beautiful answer. That's the exact answer. I mean, totally, you nail it. I loved if someone just in an interview came out with that answer, because yes, consistency is much more important than any given standard that you see out there. And I think that's perfect. What I would add up to the answer is that I would say, like, okay, Angular does have a style guide, right? Like where a lot of opinionated people suggest how you should name things. And you're probably seen this before, right? Like try to be clear. For example, when you're naming a function, a variable, a class, or whatever, try to be clear. One of the suggestions I make is don't add metadata. I'm going to jump into that in a second. And then consider the context. Let's take a look at an example. Let's take a look at this challenge. For all of you, can you come up with a name for a variable that stores the maximum inactivity time allowed for a transaction in an online store? It's like, we need to name this variable, but we don't know what name to give it. What name would you give it? Like, think it for a second. Like, what will be a proper name for this? This is all the context we have. We don't have any more information. This is all we have. What name would you give it? Does anyone want to give it a try?
Max trans inactive.
Oh, good God. How on earth is that semantic? I would know. I had no idea what that meant. Although maybe my variables are like way too stupid. I would literally go with something like inactive user.
I've got one.
Go ahead.
Transaction idle time.
Oh, that's good.
Okay, fine. You're the winner.
All right. And that's anyone? Mike does have one. Is Mike with us?
Yeah, I would use X and put a comment above it.
So my husband loves to his go-to variable for when he can't think of a name is make muffins. So I've actually seen that in production, sadly, when he could not figure out a real name for it. So it's not a joke, Mike. Some people really do that.
This could actually be a whole game. Name that variable.
Mine's usually. I typically fall back to ASDF when I do that. But in all seriousness, I would probably use max inactive time.
All right. That's a good one. Let's take a look at what are the wrong answers. So transaction time. I believe this is a wrong answer, and please don't take this as mandatory. This is just my opinion. But transaction time is not clear enough. It doesn't state what are you actually measuring here, or what's this value contain. So transaction time is just very general, very wide, very broad. So you need something more specific. Second thing is that transaction inactivity time value. The thing about this is value. I certainly believe that adding value to the name of the variable at the end is something wrong, because variables, generally speaking, have a value. Whether it's undefined or null or an actual value, they often have a value. And if you were to put value, well, you might as well put variable at the end, right? So one of my advice is not to add metadata, unnecessary metadata. It's like, of course it has a value, so let's not just add that. And the third advice I will give you is transaction inactivity time purchase product. This is unnecessary because, as I mentioned before, this is an online store which probably is selling products. So if we like, this part of the variable name is kind of unnecessary. It's like, okay, that's redundant. You're probably already in the purchase module or whatever. So you don't need to add that unnecessary name to the variable. My suggestion is transaction max inactivity time. Nonetheless, this is not necessarily the only answer. I presented these slides before in different scenarios, and people come out with great answers, just like Justin. Max idle time, I guess that's what he said. Also, people also mentioned that I should specify if these are milliseconds or seconds, because I won't be able to do that with types. So, or at least not easily. But yeah, maybe some people specify that I should add milliseconds to it, so on and so forth.
I know, that's when I get confused though, because I'm like, what counts as metadata, right? Like, because then the seconds or the milliseconds, that's metadata information about it, right? Or does that not count as, I don't know.
Yeah, that could be metadata about it as well. So that would depend on the context, like if you're inside a function, a class, on the type of the variable, because this variable could have a time type, like some constant type you define as time. So that could be metadata. The general advice will be to be as clear as possible. Try not to add unnecessary metadata. If you think this metadata is necessary, then you can add it. And then try not to be very very long names either. Just try to keep them long enough to convey a proper and clear meaning to the variable. That's pretty much.
One of the things that I've always kind of focused on for me personally is look at, how much does it add to the readability of the code, right? If I was to come back at this thing 3 months from now and look at the logic in this code, could I read the code as is without comments and kind of identify what's going on so I could get in there and figure out bugs and all that sort of stuff? So I kind of ultimately my final decision on variable naming comes down to, okay, I feel good with this one. Now, does it give enough clarity if somebody just read this line for line could make sense out of it? And that kind of helps me guide towards like thinking about that metadata and like the millisecond sort of thing, right?
Totally.
I agree with you. There's one point where I disagree, and it's a specific case. So if I am doing an operation where I have an operator that is, or like a function that is operating on either an array, iterating over an array, or an observable, and say I'm iterating over things, and things is my array, I won't necessarily use thing as the argument within that inner function. I'll use something brief like t, just because if I need to know what that is, I'm right there iterating over things so that I know that t is a thing. And then I just do that for brevity inside of inner loops when iterating over multiple things.
Yeah, good point. Good point as well. I think Justin comment summarizes both of our perspectives. Like at the very end, what we're trying to achieve is clarity, right? Like being able to look at this and being able to read it, and as long as everyone have a common understanding of whatever that variable or function is doing, then we're fine. Like if you're able to look at it in, I don't know, 6 months and still understand what it's pretty much doing, then you're good, right? So yeah. I think we can wrap it up so far. I think we're good. I think we touched base on different topics, I think, Justin, do you think it's okay if we can just stop it here?
Yeah, we're at the top of the hour, so it's a good stopping point.
All right.
Awesome. That was killer. So any last things on scalable Angular architectures, or do we want to just jump to picks?
So yeah, no, I'll just wrap up saying that, first of all, hey, thanks for your comments. As you can see, and everyone in the audience can see, if AngularAir were a developer team and we were defining our own standards, look at the most important thing is that we all have a common understanding of how we're going to do it. Instead of me coming up to the team and say, like, this is the way we're going to do things from now on, that's not how you should do it. That's when ELISA's comments is very important. It's like, hey, as long as everyone's doing consistently, as long as the team is agreed on something, then you should probably be good to go. That's my summary to it.
I think the worst is whenever like the team is like, hey, we're going to do it this way. We've all made up our minds. And then you get a PR that like they just didn't want to follow it. And you're just like, so no, yeah, that's why it's kind of,
yeah, that
thank you so much for coming on and doing the show with us today.
Sure.
Yeah. So one final question on that, then, like, how important is it? I mean, it's all grain of salt relatively, but like to think about creating a design doc that defines your practices, right? Like how much time should teams spend on that? Obviously in terms of like Angular, we can go to angular.io and start with that style guide and kind of get a jump start on those things. But, spending time as a team, I've always found effective to try and put together some type of design doc that illustrates how we're going to do these things, these structures and things like that. So not only your existing team, but as you get an influx of new team members or third-party people that come on and work on your stuff, you have some rough guideline, because obviously over time your application code will kind of have that in it, right? And you can say, oh, go look at the code, right? But yeah.
No, I think that's super key, actually. Justin, every time I'm going to kickstart the project in the company, one of the key processes is defining like best practices to follow or a code patterns, a guideline. This is generally accompanied of a TS-lint file where we have like all these rules that will help us kind of minify what ELISA just mentioned about like people just doing it wrong, right? Sometimes also some other tools such as Commitizer, and the builds failing if they're not following the proper standards, and pre-tier, and maybe same co-editor configuration. So pretty much everyone is just following it easier, smoother. So yeah, totally. That's something I will spend enough time, whatever the team needs. Usually, I don't know, you can take up to 2 days, maybe 1 day, to figure out and agree with your team what standards are you going to follow. And most importantly, keep iterating it, right? Things will change over time. You will realize you made bad decisions, like that was not a good approach, to name things with an X maybe. So kidding. So yeah, keep iterating it and you'll be fine.
Juan, that's a great point about the TS lint, and we could almost do a whole nother episode on that, where once you've established some of your patterns, like how can you help automate that process? Because there's these several ways, like you mentioned, to help our teams be more effective at that without having to reference a design doc and things like that. We should do like a full episode just on that. That'd be great. All right. Well, let's get to some picks. Who has picks? Alyssa, do you have any picks?
I do, and I will link to it in the Twitters and in the comments on the YouTubes, but it's an Angular developer survey. Pretty short. There's a longer version you can opt into, but I know that they take our feedback seriously. So it's from the Angular team. So I will link to that.
Cool. Thank you. Bonnie, do you have anything today?
Not this week.
All right. Mike?
Sure.
Which is quite all right if you don't, no problem.
Why do you sound scared, Mike?
I wasn't sure of the name of it, so I was looking it up.
Oh, you know what? We should have had Juan ask us these questions.
Now, my pick is something called Browser Preview. It's an extension for VS Code that allows you to essentially host a browser window inside of VS Code. So as you're developing something for the web, you don't have to leave your editor for any other reasons, because you can just open up a new tab that has your browser running side by side with your code, all in one place, one-stop shopping.
Nice.
Very cool. All right, Juan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I have two picks. The first one is something I'm gonna put in the chat, is a URL where you will be able to find all my VS Code configuration to make sure you follow the best standards, best practices. It has like every single rule you'll ever need, or you're probably gonna need at some point. So you can just, if you don't have anything in your VS Code right now in the audience, you can just go there, copy paste, and then iterate from there and customize it. You're gonna like it. And then the second one is that I'm very excited to share that this Saturday we're gonna have a meetup in our community, and this is being the greatest meetup of all. We have 290 people sign up for this, and in my internal machine learning process of figuring out how much actually that is, it's about 150, 160 people, and that's just too much. We're super excited about it. Maybe this can serve as feedback for other community organizers. This probably happened because we changed the format of our meetups, and we're now doing workshops and lightning talks. Instead of doing a meetup full of 3 long talks with people and then just eating in the breaks and networking, we're kind of aiming it at practical options, right? Like having a workshop for everyone to do there, and it seems to people to do practical stuff. So those are my picks.
Wow, that sounds really cool. That'll be interesting to hear how that goes with that many people, right? And providing support during the workshop time for all of that, right? And people bringing their own stuff and having it set up ahead of time. But yeah, it's certainly, that sounds compelling. Awesome. Very awesome. All right, Juan. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and coming on and talking about this stuff. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. You've been awesome. You've been super cool host, so I really appreciate it.
Great, thanks. And all of our panelists, we're hoping to get offer sheets in the mail from our questions that we answered. Looking for that future employment. All right, everyone, have a good one. We will see you next time. Later.
Bye.